The monastery was not built for war. Its walls, thick and cold, were meant to keep out the winds of winter, not the storms of steel. Yet, in the year of our Lord, when kingdoms bled and the earth trembled beneath the march of armies, these stone corridors would shelter a man destined to carry both the Bible and the blade. The hour was before dawn. Candles burned low, their flames swaying in the faint draught that crept through the cloister's archways. Somewhere in the chapel, a single voice sang the last notes of matins, that gentle chant that began each day in service to God. But at the far end of the refectory, past the long tables where bread and stew were shared in silence, a lone figure knelt on the flagstone floor. His robe was the deep brown of his order, frayed at the cuffs from years of wear. His hands, folded in prayer, were calloused and scarred, not from the quill or the plough, but from the hilt of a sword. Brother Matthias had been a man of war before he was a man of God. Some whispered that his choice to take vows had been penance for blood spilled in the service of a Lord now long dead. Others said he had turned his back on the world's violence out of grief, though none could name the woman whose memory was said to haunt his silence. To the brethren, he was simply one of their own, steadfast in prayer, tireless in work, his eyes always distant, as though seeing a battlefield beyond the cloister walls. The world outside those walls was changing. The banners of rival kings fluttered over sieges that starved entire cities. Lords spoke less of faith and more of territory, their alliances shifting like the wind. The Pope's word could crown an emperor, or condemn him. And through it all, the great orders of the Church, the Benedictines, the Templars, the Hospitallers, found themselves drawn deeper into the politics of war. Monasteries became storehouses of grain and gold, their abbots called to council courts, their brethren asked to bless armies before the march. In such a world, the idea of a monk taking up arms was no longer unthinkable, though still controversial, even dangerous. For Matthias, the conflict was not merely of kingdoms but of the soul. His days began with the sound of the bell and the rhythm of prayer, yet his body remembered the weight of chainmail, the measured breath before a charge, the way a soldier reads the ground for advantage. When he worked the monastery's vineyard, his grip on the pruning knife was steady, deliberate, the same grip with which he might once have drawn a dagger from its sheath. And then, the rumors began. A foreign army, brutal and swift, was moving through the borderlands. Villages burned in their wake, the smoke could be seen for miles. Refugees came through the monastery gates, women clutching children, old men leaning on broken staves. They spoke of soldiers who desecrated churches, who laughed at priests, who cut down the unarmed without hesitation. At first, the abbot ordered more food prepared for the hungry and more prayers said for the dead. But soon, the stories grew darker. The enemy had taken a fortress just 3 days' ride from the monastery. Worse still, they had sworn to tear down every house of God in the region. The brethren gathered in the chapter house, their voices low but urgent. Some argued that the monastery should seal its gates and trust in divine protection. Others said they should flee to the safety of the larger abbeys nearer the capital. Matthias listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the wooden crucifix above the abbot's chair. He knew, as only a soldier could, that neither walls nor prayers would stop a determined army. It was then that the abbot turned to him. "Brother," he said, "you have seen war. You know what is coming. Tell us what must be done." The room fell silent. The candles flickered in the draught from the high windows. Matthias rose slowly, the folds of his robe whispering against the stone. He spoke not as a monk but as the man he had once been, a captain of men, hardened by campaigns no one else in that room had endured. He told them that the enemy would not spare them, that their relics and books would be lost, their brethren scattered or slain. And then, he said something that would change the course of his life: if we would keep what is holy, we must be ready to defend it, with more than prayers. Some gasped. Others crossed themselves. The abbot's gaze was steady, though his lips were thin with worry. He knew the weight of what was being asked, and what it would cost. Monks were bound to peace, their vows taken before God himself. To take up arms was to risk not only life but soul. Yet the choice was no longer between war and peace. It was between survival and annihilation. By the week's end, the monastery's storerooms had been opened, and what little coin they could spare was sent to hire men from the surrounding villages. Peasants, minor knights, even a handful of veterans answered the call, drawn less by pay than by the strange novelty of a monk calling them to arms. Matthias began to drill them in the meadow beyond the cloister walls. The sound of chanting at lauds was now followed by the ring of steel and the bark of orders. The vineyard became a training ground. The bell that once called the brethren to prayer now also marked the change of watch. In the evenings, when the torches were lit and the men sat around the fire, they would ask him how a servant of God could lead them into battle. Matthias would answer with the same words each time: a shepherd does not abandon his flock when the wolves come. Outside the cloister, the wolves were drawing closer. And the shepherd was sharpening his sword. The days that followed were unlike anything the monastery had seen in living memory. The cloister, once a sanctuary of whispered prayers and turning pages, now echoed with the thud of boots and the rasp of whetstones. Steel glinted where once there had been only candlelight. The air smelled of oil for armor instead of incense. Brother Matthias had not sought command, but command had sought him. The men looked to him not only for orders but for purpose. They saw in him something rare, a leader who spoke with the conviction of faith but understood the grim arithmetic of war. He drilled them relentlessly, not because he craved victory, but because he knew the price of defeat. His first task was to bring order to chaos. Many of the recruits were farmers who had never marched more than a mile from their fields. Some were boys, their hands still soft from labor that had never involved a blade. Others were aging veterans, whose scars told stories of campaigns long past. Matthias did not waste time with grand speeches. Instead, he taught them how to stand in a shield wall, how to brace against the charge of cavalry, how to listen for the call of the horn over the din of battle. Each morning began with the same ritual: prayer at dawn, drills until noon, weapons practice until the sun dipped low. Matthias moved among them, correcting stances, demonstrating strikes, and reminding them, always, that the fight ahead was not for conquest but for preservation. "We do not go to spill blood," he told them. "We go to keep what is sacred from being defiled." But not all were convinced. One afternoon, as the men rested by the well, a grizzled knight named Arnulf approached him. Arnulf had fought for lords and kings, had seen abbeys sacked and cities burned. "Tell me truthfully, brother," Arnulf said. "Do you think God cares for the walls of this place? For books and relics? Or is this war just another excuse for men to kill each other?" Matthias held his gaze. "God may not need these walls," he said quietly. "But the people do. They need a place where they are safe. They need hope. And sometimes hope must be defended with steel." Word of the monastery's armed preparations spread quickly. It reached neighboring lords, some of whom sent token aid, a few spears here, a wagon of supplies there, more out of curiosity than loyalty. It also reached the ears of the enemy. Scouts reported seeing riders on the horizon, their banners unfamiliar, their movements purposeful. The invasion was no longer a rumor, it was a certainty. The abbot, troubled by the sight of swords in the cloister, summoned Matthias late one night. The candlelight in his chamber flickered over parchment maps and letters sealed with the wax of distant bishops. "Brother," he began, "you know this is not what we were meant to be. Our order prays, it does not fight." Matthias bowed his head. "And if we pray while the wolves tear down the doors? Will God count our silence as faith, or as cowardice?" The abbot said nothing for a long while. At last, he nodded. "Then you will lead them. But you will remember this: you are a servant of God first and a commander second. Do not let one swallow the other." The following morning, Matthias stood before his assembled force, a ragged mix of brown-robed brothers and leather-clad villagers, knights in patched armor beside barefoot peasants with spears. The sun was rising over the meadow, casting long shadows that stretched toward the monastery's gate. Matthias raised his voice so all could hear. You have taken up arms not for glory, but for your homes. Not for plunder, but for the lives behind these walls. We may be few, but we are bound together by something stronger than numbers. We fight for each other. Remember that, and no man can truly defeat you. There was no cheer, no roar of voices. Only the steady, grim silence of men who knew the road ahead. And in that silence, Matthias felt the weight settle fully upon him. He was no longer simply a monk with a sword. He was their commander. The meadow beyond the monastery walls had become a field of preparation. Where grapevines once tangled in the summer sun, rows of men now marched in rhythm, the dull thud of their boots kicking up dry earth. Every day the formation grew tighter, the shields lifted faster, the spears braced more firmly. Matthias knew that skill in arms was only part of readiness. The heart of an army lay in its will to march. The first weeks were consumed by the basics: pack discipline, supply lines, camp security. The monastery's cellars, once accustomed to storing wine and grain for the brethren, now measured out rations of salted meat and hard bread, wrapping them in cloth for travel. The armorer, a former lay brother, worked without rest, hammering dents from shields, rest-wrapping leather, sharpening edges. Every piece of steel was accounted for, every man was drilled until muscle memory replaced hesitation. Matthias walked among the ranks with a watchful eye. He corrected the boy who held his spear too loosely, steadied the nervous farmer whose shield arm trembled after an hour. When the men grumbled about the weight of their packs, he reminded them that a soldier who cannot carry his own load would not survive a day in the field. Still, he allowed moments of respite, a shared loaf of bread at sunset, a story told by the fire. He knew that an army bound by shared hardship and trust would stand longer than one held together by fear. Scouts returned with troubling news: the enemy's forward companies had crossed the river to the east. Villages along the border had been abandoned, their thatched roofs left to the wind. The monastery lay directly on the road to the capital. To wait behind its walls would be to offer the enemy an undefended path into the heartland. It was then Matthias made the decision: they would march to meet the enemy before the enemy could choose the ground. The announcement was met with a heavy silence. These men had expected to defend what was theirs, not leave it behind. But Matthias explained what every commander knows: the battle must be fought where you hold the advantage, not where you are most comfortable. The departure came at dawn. The monastery bell tolled not for prayer but for the march. Brothers in their brown robes walked alongside armored knights, spears in hand. The gates swung wide and the column began to move, a slow, steady line that stretched along the dirt road, the monastery shrinking behind them with every step. Some turned to look back. Matthias did not. Along the way, the column passed through empty hamlets and charred fields. They found abandoned carts, their contents spilled on the road, and wells poisoned to keep them from the enemy. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and damp earth. In these moments, Matthias saw doubt flicker in his men's eyes, but he kept them moving. He spoke of the ground ahead, of the hill where they would stand, of the victory that must be won there. By the third day, the scouts returned again. The enemy was near. Matthias ordered the column to halt at a natural rise in the land, bordered by a stream on one side and a copse of trees on the other. It was here they would make their stand. The march was over. The battle was about to begin. The morning broke under a sky the color of iron. A low mist clung to the ground, curling between the legs of men and horses like the breath of something waiting. Matthias stood on the rise, his cloak pulled tight against the chill, his eyes fixed on the tree lean to the east. Somewhere beyond it, the enemy was gathering. The men were silent save for the creak of leather straps and the clink of mail. The stream murmured softly at their flank, a natural barrier that would keep the enemy from circling them easily. Behind the line, campfires burned low, their smoke rising straight into the still air. Every man knew that once the horn sounded, there would be no retreat. Matthias moved along the front, speaking not in lofty sermons but in the steady voice of a commander who would stand and fall with them. Hold the line. Trust the man beside you. Let no gap open between your shields. His gaze caught the young farmer from the monastery's vineyards, his knuckles white around the shaft of his spear, and Matthias laid a hand on his shoulder. When the moment comes, remember you fight for your home. The enemy emerged with the slow inevitability of a storm. First came the sound, the dull thunder of hooves, the rattle of armor, the distant bark of orders. Then shapes in the mist, banners snapping above dark ranks, the glint of spear points, the measured advance of infantry in formation. Their cavalry rode to the flanks, their archers already stringing bows. The first volley came like a hiss of rain, arrows arcing high, their tips vanishing into the pale sky before falling among the defenders. Shields thudded under the impact, a few men cried out, and Matthias gave the order, shields high. Hold! The second volley was met with tighter discipline, the shield wall absorbing the storm. Then came the charge. The enemy infantry surged forward, the ground shaking beneath the mass of bodies. Matthias waited until they were close enough that he could see the fury in their faces, smell the sweat and leather. Then he shouted the word, now, and the front line braced, spears leveled. The clash was a wall of sound, steel striking steel, the grunt of effort, the scream of pain. Men shoved and swung, the lines buckling and reforming, each side straining to break the other. On the left flank, the enemy cavalry found a gap. Matthias saw it, a weakness that could split the line, and without hesitation he waded into the fray. His sword, long and used, felt both foreign and familiar in his grip. He struck not with the fury of youth but with the precision of a man who had survived too many battles to waste motion. The men saw him there, their commander, shoulder to shoulder with them, and their faltering line stiffened. The fighting dragged on, the mist turning to the acrid haze of dust and sweat. The enemy pressed harder, their numbers greater, their shouts rising in a rhythm meant to intimidate. Matthias countered not with noise but with resolve. At a critical moment, he ordered the reserve, monks armed with spears and shields, to push forward, driving into the enemy's exposed flank. It was an unorthodox move, the sight of brown-robed figures surging into the melee unsettling the enemy more than the steel they carried. Then came the turning point. A horn sounded from the tree line, not theirs, but the enemy's. Confusion rippled through their ranks. Scouts would later report that a separate force had struck the enemy's supply line at dawn, forcing their commander to reconsider the battle. But in the moment, Matthias knew only that the enemy's advance had faltered. He raised his sword high, the sun breaking through the clouds to catch the steel, and shouted the charge. The defenders surged forward as one. The enemy line crumpled under the sudden ferocity, their retreat swift and chaotic. Men who had fought with the weight of desperation now fought with the momentum of hope, and hope proved the sharper weapon. When the last of the enemy vanished into the trees, the field was silent save for the labored breathing of the living and the soft moans of the wounded. The stream still murmured at their side as though the battle had been only a brief disturbance in its endless song. Matthias lowered his sword. Around him, men looked not at the bodies on the ground, but at the monastery's brown-cloaked leader, the warrior monk who had led them through fire and faith and returned with victory. The field still bore the scars of war when the sun began its slow descent. Bodies lay in broken lines where the fighting had been fiercest, the churned earth stained dark in places where the grass would not grow again for years. Crows circled overhead, their harsh cries cutting through the quiet. Victory had been won, but the cost was written in blood. Matthias moved among the wounded, his robe torn, his face marked with streaks of sweat and grime. He knelt beside each man, offering words of comfort, a touch to the shoulder, or the sign of the cross. Some would live to see home, others would not survive the night. There was no triumph in his eyes, only the heavy knowing that every man lost was a life entrusted to him. The men began the grim work of clearing the field. Enemy dead were gathered in one place, their weapons stripped, their banners taken. The bodies of their own were carried to a hastily consecrated ground near the stream. The monks who had fought prayed over the graves, their voices low and steady, as if the chants might bind the souls of the fallen to the peace they had sought to defend. That evening, the survivors gathered in what remained of the camp. Fires flickered, casting shadows that swayed over weary faces. No one sang. The sound that filled the air was the quiet murmur of men speaking in low tones, remembering a brother in arms, recounting a moment in the fight, wondering aloud if the enemy would return. The abbot had come from the monastery to see the field himself. He walked slowly, leaning on a staff, his expression unreadable. When he reached Matthias, he did not speak at first. The two men stood together, looking out over the camp, the stream glinting faintly in the fading light. "You have done what no one thought possible," the abbot said at last. Matthias shook his head. "We have done what was necessary." "And yet," the abbot replied, "you have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The monastery will not be the same. Nor will you." The truth of it weighed on Matthias. He had led men into battle and brought them back alive, most of them, but the blood on his hands was as real as the sword at his side. He had defended the holy, but at the price of breaking vows made before God. It was a victory that did not feel pure. The next day, the survivors began their slow march home. As the monastery's towers came into view, there was no cheer, no celebration. They entered in silence, bearing the wounded first, then the relics and banners taken from the field. The gates closed behind them with a deep, echoing finality. In the days that followed, life in the cloister resumed, prayer at dawn, the tending of fields, the copying of manuscripts, but something in the air had changed. The brethren spoke more softly, their eyes lingering on Matthias with a mixture of reverence and unease. He had saved them, yes. But he had also shown that even within sacred walls, the shadow of war could find its way. Victory had come, but peace was still far away. Years later, the story of the warrior monk was told in many voices, some speaking in hushed reverence, others in measured skepticism. In taverns along the trade roads, travelers spoke of a man who had stepped from the quiet of a cloister to meet an army head-on. In the halls of lords, his name was invoked as proof that the church could wield not only the word but the sword. Among the brethren, his deeds were remembered in a mixture of pride and unease, like a candle's flame that gave both light and danger. Chroniclers, eager for tales that stirred the soul, wrote his life in broad strokes. They spoke of the mist-shrouded battlefield, of the brown-robed figures who held the line, of the charge that broke the enemy's will. They gave the battle a name, one that would appear in illuminated manuscripts alongside the great clashes of the age. Yet as the decades passed, the details blurred. The man who had known hesitation and doubt became, in the retelling, a figure of unshakable purpose. His inner conflicts faded from the record, replaced by the certainty that legends demand. Matthias himself never sought the title given to him, commander, savior, saint. In his later years, he returned fully to the life of the cloister, refusing offers from lords who wished to place him at the head of their armies. He walked the monastery's cloisters in silence, his sword kept not in the armory but in a small, unlit chamber where only he would see it again. When asked about the battle, he would say only, "God's work is not always gentle." But his story endured because it spoke to something larger than the man. It was a reminder that faith and force, so often seen as opposites, could in certain moments meet, and that such moments carried both salvation and cost. It became a lesson for soldiers and preachers alike, that to protect what is sacred sometimes requires standing where you swore you never would, and that victory won with steel leaves marks no prayer can erase. Centuries later, historians still debate him, whether he was hero or heretic, whether his choice was necessity or sin. Yet the fields where he fought are quiet now, the stream still murmurs, and the monastery still stands. And in the shadow of its walls, the story of the warrior monk lingers, not as an answer, but as a question.